nobody at Redwood Falls National Bank expected Chris Hemsworth's response. On a cool, overcast morning in the small town of Redwood Falls, Minnesota, the sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and a faint mist gathered on the streets. Businesses were just opening their doors, employees trickling in with warm cups of coffee, dressed in tidy shirts and jackets. Although Redwood Falls wasn't large, a quiet town nestled between gently rolling hills, it held its own character, a single main street lined with local shops, a few diners whose neon signs buzzed to life at dawn, and at the center of it all, the venerable Redwood Falls National Bank, an institution locals viewed as rock, solid and essential. The building's stone facade and grand pillars testified to a history spanning several generations, a place where townspeople entrusted their savings and believed they would receive respect, dignity, and fair treatment no matter their background. Inside the bank's polished lobby, tall ceilings and marble floors created a sense of hushed reverence. Men and women in neat suits hurried to their respective stations behind a gleaming row of teller windows. Chris Hemsworth hadn't planned on drawing any attention that morning. He'd come to Redwood Falls under the radar to work on a small documentary project. The nature of his visit was tied to financial accessibility and community uplift, subjects that, to many, might not immediately seem riveting. But Chris believed that stories of ordinary people confronting everyday struggles often revealed more about humanity than any big-budget film ever could. He had arrived in a modest SUV, unaccompanied by a typical Hollywood entourage, hoping to keep his presence low-key. Despite his best efforts, within an hour of his arrival, a few residents recognized him at the local cafe, snapping pictures and whispering in hushed excitement. Yet Redwood Falls citizens, known for valuing privacy, allowed him enough personal space to explore the bank's day-to-day operations without a massive commotion. That morning, as Chris slipped into the bank's lobby, only a handful of patrons were scattered about. The subtle hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the gentle click of shoes on the polished floor. Workers arranged their cash drawers. A manager in a charcoal gray suit, his gold name tag reading, Branch Manager Robert Ellison, stood near an office door, wearing the carefully practiced smile of someone who understood public relations. Next to him was a younger woman with neatly pulled back hair, an assistant manager or senior teller, perhaps. Sunlight tried to break through the overcast gloom, filtering through tall windows in hazy bands that gave the bank an almost dreamlike glow. Chris had come prepared for a routine shoot, gather some footage of the bank, speak to employees about best practices in handling customers with unique challenges, and highlight Redwood Falls as an example of a small American town grappling with modern issues. But soon enough, the morning's quiet normalcy cracked. A thin, older gentleman, perhaps in his early 70s, pushed through the tall glass doors. He wore a pressed but clearly well-worn jacket, and the slight tremors in his hands signaled the presence of Parkinson's disease. Balancing against a wooden cane with a curved handle, he approached the nearest teller window, one staffed by a young man in a crisp white shirt named Marcus, who was in the midst of counting some bills. At first glance, there seemed no cause for alarm. Chris, standing a few paces away with a small handheld camera, looked on as the older man tried to greet Marcus politely. The man's speech came in a series of cautious, sometimes stumbling words, no doubt influenced by the neurological progression of Parkinson's. Marcus, initially polite, asked for the gentleman's account information. But as the older man struggled to take out his wallet and retrieve his ID, the teller's demeanor changed. The lines of courtesy in his face began to fade. He watched the man's trembling hands, tapping his own fingers impatiently. After a few tense moments, Marcus abruptly sighed and shook his head. He quietly asked the gentleman if he might step aside so other patrons could be helped first. The older man, clearly aware of the inconvenience his unsteady movements might pose, acquiesced, stepping aside with an apologetic shrug, but a flash of hurt darkened his eyes. Chris's brow furrowed. Something about the exchange unsettled him. It wasn't unusual for bank lines to shift people around, but it was the cold, dismissive tone in Marcus's voice that triggered concern. Chris continued filming unobtrusively, capturing how the older man hovered near a row of plush chairs, fumbling with his wallet in an attempt to get his ID ready before the teller changed his mind. After a few minutes, the line emptied. The older gentleman returned to the window, greeting Marcus again with a shaky nod. By this point, the man had managed to retrieve his ID and was ready to deposit a small check, likely his Social Security or pension. Chris caught the subtle jerk in the man's shoulders, the stiff set of his jaw that signaled both embarrassment and determination to simply complete his transaction. Yet the tension only grew. Marcus eyed the ID with obvious skepticism. His expression suggested he doubted the authenticity of the signature because of the older man's shaky handwriting. He glanced behind him to see if a superior was watching. Then, as though emboldened by the sight of manager Robert Ellison in the back office, Marcus's tone hardened. He refused to process the check, claiming the signature was unreadable and that the gentleman might be trying to pull a fast one on the bank. The older man stammered, trying to explain that he had Parkinson's, that his signature had changed over the years, but it was still his official mark. He had multiple forms of identification too. He just needed a little more time to get them out. Instead of offering compassion, Marcus shot back that the bank had strict guidelines. He reiterated that if a signature didn't match or was too illegible, they couldn't complete the transaction. At this point, Chris's stomach twisted. He couldn't stand by silently. Before he spoke up, however, a second teller approached. This was a middle-aged woman with auburn hair swept into a neat bun. Her nameplate read, Amanda. She seemed torn, glancing at Marcus, then at the old man, and back again. Clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. Still, she remained quiet, possibly fearful of undermining a colleague in full view of customers. The older gentleman's voice shook even more than his body. He insisted that he'd banked here for years, that everyone in Redwood Falls knew him. He'd never had such trouble before. It was the first time he'd encountered anyone questioning the validity of his signature in such a manner. A hush fell over the lobby. Customers in line looked on, uncertain whether to intervene, and that was when Chris gently stepped forward. Softly, but with conviction, he introduced himself, admitting that yes, he was Chris Hemsworth, and asked if the older man needed any assistance. Marcus froze at the mention of the actor's name. A flicker of recognition passed over his features, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might backtrack. Perhaps it was the star power or the camera rolling that made him second-guess the harsh attitude. But manager Robert Ellison, alerted by the tension, took that moment to stride out from his office, posture stiff, teeth pulled tight, projecting an aura of unwavering authority. "Is there a problem here?" Robert asked, glancing sharply between Chris, the older man, and Marcus. His voice came out clipped, shaped by years of banking and a lifetime of maintaining a certain level of decorum. Chris opened his mouth to speak, but the older gentleman tried to explain first. He introduced himself as Gregory James, a Redwood Falls resident since birth. He politely stated he merely wanted to deposit his check, that he was an honest customer, but that his Parkinson sometimes made it difficult for him to hold a pen or sign neatly. Marcus muttered something about policy. The manager nodded curtly, then turned to Nitley, James with the kind of expression one might reserve for a misbehaving child. To Chris's shock, Robert asked if Mr. James could return later when the bank wasn't so busy, so they could sort out the paperwork under less stressful conditions. Chris felt his outrage building. The lobby, in truth, wasn't that busy. A couple of people stood off to one side, stunned into silence. The clock on the wall read just past 9 a.m. Business hours had barely begun. Yet the manager was already attempting to shuffle away a man who was physically vulnerable, all for the sake of policy. As Chris raised his voice slightly in protest, he saw the camera lens in his hand reflect the bank's artificial lights. He took a moment to consider the moral weight of filming this. He wanted to show the world the challenges faced by those with disabilities in everyday scenarios, but he also didn't want to exploit the gentleman's hardship. Carefully, he asked Mr. James if it would be all right to keep filming. The older man looked uncertain, but after a moment, nodded. He wanted people to know this was happening. The manager glared. "We don't allow professional filming in our branch without clearance," he stated firmly, offering no gesture of compromise. In that tone, Chris recognized the quiet mask of corporate authority, the one that valued policy over humanity. But Redwood Falls was a public place, and the bank's lobby, though the private property, had never been particularly strict about local newscasts or community features. Now, however, with a Hollywood face in the mix, Robert Ellison seemed determined to control the narrative. Chris, refusing to be intimidated, lowered the camera to appear less confrontational. He spoke in calm, measured tones, asking Robert to show some leniency, to simply verify Miss James's identity through additional forms, like a social security card or an old bank statement. The manager hesitated. The crowd in the lobby grew slightly, as if they, too, sensed an oncoming confrontation. A young mother cradled her toddler near the entrance, not wanting the child to witness a scene. Two older patrons edged closer, murmuring among themselves that Mr. James was, indeed, a longtime Redwood Falls resident. Marcus shot the manager a look that said he wanted Robert to back him. Chris read the manager's eye as Robert was calculating, probably wondering if a small wave of negative publicity was worth delivering some courtesy, or if the bank's policies were so ironclad that he couldn't risk setting a precedent. Moments stretched, tension thick enough to taste. Mr. James's voice trembled again, this time from the humiliation of being treated like a suspect. Chris felt a surge of empathy for the man's plight. All the older gentleman wanted was to complete a standard transaction. Instead, he was treated with suspicion and told to come back another time, as though he were a nuisance. And this wasn't an isolated event. As Chris recalled from his initial research, many people with disabilities faced unyielding barriers in financial institutions. From physically inaccessible branches to staff who didn't know how to accommodate conditions like Parkinson's, dementia, or reduced mobility. This moment was a microcosm of a much bigger problem, and Chris realized, with a sense of both dread and determination, that Redwood Falls National Bank was about to become the center of his documentary. Robert Ellison's reluctance to relent opened the door to a deeper institutional issue. As the manager, he was the face of the bank's leadership. His silence in the face of injustice, and the way he tried to sidestep the problem by encouraging Mr. James to leave, exposed a disturbing lack of empathy. If Redwood Falls prided itself on community and caring for neighbors, why did its primary financial institution rely on such rigid rules? Why did no one have the simple training or the willingness to help an elderly man sign a slip or verify his check in a more compassionate way? Chris breathed slowly, deciding that while he didn't want to cause a spectacle, he also couldn't walk away. This might be the exact catalyst the documentary needed to highlight the financial struggles of vulnerable individuals. He turned to Mr. James, quietly suggesting they step aside for a moment to talk. "Yes, sir," James agreed, relief mixing with despair on his face. The older man's breathing was shallow, and Chris suspected the stress was exacerbating his tremors. In a discreet corner of the lobby, they spoke softly. Chris learned that Mr. James had recently lost his wife, that he was living alone, and that the check he held was from a small insurance settlement. He relied on this money for medication and basic expenses. He never thought depositing it would become a test of his dignity. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Mr. James said. "I just need to handle my affairs like anyone else." Chris placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder, careful not to startle him. "I understand. Let me see what I can do." Feeling a swell of protectiveness, Chris walked back to the manager. He asked Robert Ellison directly, in a voice that echoed across the marble floor, if the bank had a policy for accommodating people with disabilities. Robert responded with the typical corporate jargon about verifying identity and following procedure. Chris pressed him, calmly but firmly, about whether any staff had training on assisting customers with Parkinson's, stroke complications, or other conditions that might impair their fine motor skills. Robert squirmed at this. His carefully manicured composure wavered, though he attempted to maintain authority. "We don't discriminate," Robert stated. "We simply have a process for ensuring signatures match. Unfortunately, if his signature is too altered, we can't confirm it's his." He sounded as if he were reading from a script. "We do our best, but sometimes we have to abide by what's written in the guidelines." In those words, Chris heard not just the manager's personal stance, but also the bank's broader institutional approach. An approach that left no room for real empathy. And Chris, in that moment, decided to push further. If Redwood Falls National Bank prided itself on serving the local community, how could it justify turning away a lifelong resident simply because his writing hand was compromised by Parkinson's? People in the lobby continued to watch, some pulling out their phones to record. A wave of murmurs traveled across the marble floor like ripples on a pond. Amanda, the middle-aged teller who had looked conflicted, slowly approached. She cleared her throat, trying to catch Robert's eye. "We could use secondary verification," she suggested. "We have his photo on file from years of membership. And he does have a social security card with him." She spoke hesitantly, as though worried about repercussions from her boss. Her quiet willingness to help, however, revealed an undercurrent of compassion that Robert had so far failed to demonstrate. For a split second, the manager seemed to consider dismissing her, but then he caught the silent stares from the waiting customers. Even Marcus, whose stance had been hostile a moment ago, seemed uncertain, shifting his weight from foot to foot, occasionally flicking anxious glances at Chris's camera. Reluctantly, Robert gave a curt nod. "Fine, but I want you to handle it personally, Amanda. If anything's out of order, we'll have to halt the transaction." He spoke as though fulfilling a burdensome favor, ignoring that what he was doing was simply the right thing. Amanda smiled in relief, gesturing for Monsieur James to follow her to a desk off to the side where customers typically opened new accounts or signed loan documents. She whispered an apology to him, soft enough that the rest of the crowd might not hear, but Chris's heightened attention caught the gist of it. Chris felt a flood of relief. He exhaled, aware that the tension in the room hadn't dissolved, but perhaps a small victory was within reach for Mr. James. Quietly, Chris resumed filming, not out of sensationalism, but to document an unfiltered glimpse of a systemic issue, the clash between corporate policy and human compassion. This was, after all, the essence of why he had come to Redwood Falls, to uncover how everyday systems either supported or failed people who needed them most. But as Amanda began processing Mr. James's paperwork, Chris couldn't ignore the fervent look Robert gave him. The manager's eyes flickered with something resembling indignation, maybe embarrassment, at being called out in front of his staff and customers. Chris recognized that look from those who valued power and order above growth or change. Robert might comply today, but there was a good chance he'd try to prevent any lasting reforms. He was, in a sense, supposed to be a guardian of the community's financial well-being, a protector of everyone's deposits. But the cracks Chris saw suggested a deeper corruption of values, an institution that cared more about rigid policies than the dignity of its patrons. A couple of hours later, Mr. James's deposit was finally processed. Amanda, quietly efficient, found ways to verify his identity and ensure the check was legitimate. By then, The small crowd had mostly dispersed, though some lingered to chat softly. Chris, camera in hand, walked Miss James out of the bank, asking if he felt comfortable telling more of his story. The older man, wary but grateful, nodded. They stepped outside into the overcast day. The sky remained a pale gray, a light breeze steering the air, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the cafe down the street. The reflective windows of Redwood Falls National Bank glimmered behind them, an imposing structure meant to inspire confidence, yet a place that had just humiliated a valued resident. "Thank you, Mr. Hemsworth," Mr. James said softly. "I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me." "Not like that." The faint tremor in his voice wasn't just from his condition. It was a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Chris patted his arm gently. "You don't owe me any thanks. You deserve the same respect as anyone else. I'm sorry you had to go through that." A flicker of a smile pulled at Mr. James's lips, hinting at the quiet grace he still held despite the ordeal. Back inside, manager Robert Ellison stood behind his office window, blinds cracked just enough to see Chris and Mr. James talking on the sidewalk. His expression was grim. He didn't like that a high-profile figure had publicly questioned his authority. A knot of resentment coiled in his chest. He told himself that he wasn't in the wrong, that bank policies existed for a reason, that any softness in enforcement could open the floodgates to fraud or, worse, tarnish Redwood Falls National Bank's reputation. He prided himself on being a dedicated protector of the bank's interests. If he had to be stern or unyielding to safeguard it from liabilities, so be it. Yet the uneasy feeling in his gut suggested he might have gone too far. He shoved that feeling aside. From his point of view, the bank's top leadership would understand that rules came first. The arrival of someone like Chris Hemsworth with a camera in hand was an unwelcome intrusion. Robert was determined to maintain control, no matter the cost. Over the next week, Chris stayed in Redwood Falls, continuing his quiet research. He visited the senior center, where he interviewed several older citizens who had faced minor but painful obstacles with the local bank. There was a gentleman with partial blindness who described how he struggled to read the fine print on forms, only to be told the bank didn't provide large print versions. A woman with carpal tunnel syndrome recounted how a teller once got irritated at her for taking too long to sign a series of documents. Another elderly couple said they found hidden fees added to their account statements, fees they hadn't been properly informed about, some of which seemed to target older, less tech-savvy clients. Repeatedly, these folks mentioned how Redwood Falls National Bank had changed in the last few years, ever since Robert Ellison was appointed branch manager. He introduced stricter documentation processes, an insistence on exact signatures, and minimal tolerance for any perceived inconvenience. For those with perfect health or robust finances, these changes might have been unnoticed, but for people on the margins, physically or financially, this shift was devastating. Amanda, too, had a story to share, though she was initially afraid to speak. She admitted to Chris, off the record, that she'd witnessed multiple incidents of Robert pressuring staff to stick to policy rather than helping customers who struggled with the complexities of banking forms. She'd tried, on occasion, to speak up, only to be reprimanded privately for stepping out of line. The implication was that Redwood Falls National Bank, under Robert's leadership, demanded a certain image. Customers either fit neatly into the system, or they were considered problematic. Amanda found it contradictory that the bank's official motto, posted on the website and on glossy brochures, was "We're here for you." Yet the staff was expected to enforce protocols in ways that pushed vulnerable people away. She was torn between fear of losing her job. She needed the money for her family, and the growing moral conviction that something had to change. Chris grew more convinced that Redwood Falls had inadvertently become ground zero for a much larger narrative, institutional corruption hidden behind a veneer of compliance and respectability. Because it was a small town and Redwood Falls National Bank had such deep community roots, many residents accepted the changes, assuming they were standard or even beneficial for the bank's longevity. That acceptance, however, neglected those like Mr. James, whose daily lives were already full of struggles. In the quiet interviews Chris recorded, story after story emerged, forming a mosaic of an institution that had gone astray. Through it all, Chris maintained a respectful presence. He didn't waltz around proclaiming injustice at every turn, nor did he theatrically confront employees. Instead, he listened. He filmed with permission. He gently pressed those in power for answers. But Robert Ellison proved slippery. He declined every request for a formal interview, citing confidential policies. He seemed to be rallying bank lawyers behind him, ensuring Chris and his small film crew, mostly local volunteers who admired Chris's desire to highlight community issues, wouldn't get any official footage on bank property. Whenever Chris entered the bank, Robert either ducked into his office or had security politely escort Chris outside under the pretense that filming wasn't permitted. Soon enough, the local rumor mill picked up the friction. Some defended Robert's stance, saying the bank had every right to keep filming out. Others believed Chris was shining a light on a hidden darkness that had plagued Redwood Falls for years. One late afternoon, just as Chris was packing his equipment in the trunk of his SUV, Amanda rushed up to him in the parking lot behind the bank. Her face was flushed and her voice low, but urgent. She handed him a small stack of photocopied documents. "I shouldn't be showing you these," she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. "But I can't keep seeing people like Mr. James treated poorly. These documents are part of an internal memo chain among the higher-ups. It's basically instructions on how to limit services that aren't profitable, even if it negatively impacts older or disabled clients." Chris's eyebrows shot up. The papers might represent the institutional betrayal he'd suspected but hadn't yet proved. The memos discussed how certain transactions, like small check deposits, were costlier to handle when extensive identity verification was needed. The bank's leadership suggested using rigorous policies to discourage unprofitable customer segments. They rationalized it as efficiency, not discrimination. But the outcome was effectively the same, driving away people who required extra attention. Amanda swallowed hard, fear flickering across her features. "Please be careful with this. I'm not sure what Robert or corporate will do if they find out these copies are missing." Chris thanked her profusely, promising to guard her identity. After she left, he stood by his SUV, scanning the memos. Each page painted a chilling portrait of systemic greed. Redwood Falls National Bank, once a pillar of stability, had shifted gears into a profit-first strategy under new leadership. They used lofty language about safeguarding the institution's financial health to justify what was effectively discrimination. For Chris, it was the final confirmation that his documentary had to dig deeper than just a local scandal. This was a microcosm of a larger phenomenon. Banks across the country quietly pushing away inconvenient customers. The next day, Chris set up a meeting with Mr. James at the local diner. Over plates of scrambled eggs and toast, they discussed the possibility of confronting Robert and the bank's board of directors publicly. Chris wanted Mr. James's input. After all, the older gentleman would be the face of this confrontation. Though apprehensive, Mr. James recognized that staying silent would let the bank continue its harmful practices. And so, they began planning how best to bring this issue to light in a way that would hopefully lead to change, not just cause a stir. Meanwhile, Amanda confided that Robert had begun pressuring her to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the earlier incident with Mr. James. If she refused, the bank could terminate her, citing breach of internal policy. This escalation made Chris realize the stakes were higher than he'd initially thought. Redwood Falls National Bank, or at least the leadership behind it, was intent on preserving their carefully curated image. But illusions only hold up so long under the scrutiny of facts. With Amanda's documents and Mr. James's testimony, Chris felt they had a powerful case to show Redwood Falls, and perhaps beyond, that such discrimination was more than just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate policy. One crisp afternoon, with a fall chill in the air, Chris and Mr. James, along with a small group of concerned residents, marched into the lobby of Redwood Falls National Bank. They didn't come with picket signs or chanting slogans. Instead, they came with knowledge and conviction. Chris had arranged for a local news reporter, someone whose family had lived in Redwood Falls for generations, to accompany them. The bank's doors swung open, and the group filed in. Customers paused mid-transaction, and a hush fell over the space. Robert Ellison, instantly alert, strode forward, the corners of his mouth tight. "Mr. Hemsworth," he said with forced politeness, "we've been over this. We don't allow unauthorized filming here." Chris held up his hands, letting the small news crew behind him do the filming. "This isn't just about filming anymore. We have documents showing the bank has been systematically discouraging service to older and disabled clients. We want an explanation." Robert's face reddened, but he kept his tone composed. "I don't know what you think you've found, but Redwood Falls National Bank has always served this community responsibly. If you have concerns, you should schedule a meeting with our legal team." Mr. James took a shaky step forward, supported by a friend. "Robert, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father used to help me whenever I had issues at the bank. This isn't the Redwood Falls way. You can't hide behind procedures to push us out." A flicker of emotion crossed Robert's features. Anger, fear, maybe shame. For years, Redwood Falls National Bank had thrived on trust and goodwill. But now the cracks had been exposed for everyone to see. Behind him, Amanda stepped up, swallowing her nerves. She didn't speak, but her mere presence by Mr. James's side spoke volumes. Chris let the local reporter address Robert directly, citing the internal memos that Amanda had risked her job to bring forward. The manager began blustering about how these might be taken out of context, but the reporter pressed point by point, forcing Robert to contradict himself. Tension built. Staff members behind the counters exchanging anxious looks. Customers in line craned their necks to catch every word of the confrontation. Finally, Robert tried to dismiss them again. "If you want to escalate this, our lawyers will be in touch. I have no further statement." But Chris refused to let the moment slip away. "We have a responsibility," he said, voice calm yet charged with purpose, "to protect the people who trust their livelihoods to this bank. Redwood Falls deserves an institution that truly upholds the values of community. Values you claim to stand for. That includes making accommodations for people like Mr. James, not stonewalling them." Robert shook his head, then snapped, "This conversation is over," before turning on his heel and heading for his office. Even so, the seeds of change had already been planted. Over the next few days, the local news segment aired on regional channels. Footage of Robert refusing to provide a direct answer, combined with interviews from Mr. James, Amanda, and other residents, painted a damning portrait of Redwood Falls National Bank. Public outcry swept across the small town. Some longtime customers threatened to move their accounts unless the bank reversed its policies. Others demanded Robert's resignation. A few employees, emboldened by the coverage, shared more stories anonymously with the local paper, revealing that top-level instructions indeed encouraged the bank to discourage accounts that required extra time and attention. As the pressure mounted, the bank's corporate headquarters intervened. A corporate representative arrived in Redwood Falls, hoping to contain the scandal. The representative reached out to Chris, requesting a private meeting. Though cautious, Chris agreed, hoping for a productive conversation. They met at a neutral location, a modest conference room in the town's community center, one with beige walls and a ring of folding chairs. "Miss James attended alongside Chris, and so did Amanda, her head held high despite the risk. The corporate representative, a neatly dressed woman named Ingrid, offered a brisk handshake, her expression neutral but professional. We recognize that certain internal guidelines have been misapplied in Redwood Falls. Ingrid began, speaking with a carefully measured tone. This was never our intention. We apologize if customers like Mr. James experience difficulties depositing checks or receiving assistance. Chris exchanged a glance with Mr. James. The word, misapplied, sounded more like a legal deflection than a genuine admission of wrongdoing. This isn't just about one man's experience, Chris pointed out. We have multiple accounts of disabled or elderly customers being pressured out. The internal memos, the staff testimony. There's a pattern here that needs real reform. But Ingrid's posture stiffened slightly, but she pressed on. We're prepared to update our training programs, particularly around accommodating disabilities. We also intend to reassign Manager Ellison while we investigate these allegations further. Beside him, Mr. James breathed out in relief. Meanwhile, Amanda's eyes shone with cautious hope. But Chris knew words weren't enough. People in Redwood Falls needed concrete evidence that the bank would truly change. He pushed for specifics. Why, we want the Redwood Falls National Bank branch to install separate lines for those who need extra time or assistance, with dedicated staff who receive specialized training. We want the bank to publicly share how they will implement fair policies for all customers. And we don't want any retaliation against employees like Amanda, who spoke up about the wrongdoing. Ingrid listened, jotting down notes on a slim tablet. She nodded, though her expression was careful. We're open to discussing these measures. It wasn't the grand slam of accountability Chris might have hoped for, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Redwood Falls became a small epicenter of financial policy changes. The bank announced it would reevaluate its guidelines for verifying signatures, especially for those with documented medical conditions that affected their handwriting. They would implement a policy allowing an alternative verification method, one that might include digital photographs on file, or a special notary system that would come at no extra cost to the customer. The local press reported these changes widely, shining a spotlight on Redwood Falls National Bank's about-face. Residents remained skeptical, wanting to see actions rather than words. Yet there was a renewed sense of possibility in the town, a sense that maybe the bank would revert to the community-minded values it once held dear. Robert Ellison was quietly placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. Corporate's formal statement suggested they were looking into managerial decisions that may not reflect the bank's broader mission. Behind the scenes, many employees believed Robert's days at the bank were numbered. Amanda found she could breathe again, no longer worried she'd be fired. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but cracks in the bank's oppressive framework had been laid bare. And Chris, though not originally intending to become a crusader for financial rights, found that Redwood Falls was now the highlight of his documentary, no longer just about general financial accessibility, but about the fight to preserve human dignity in the face of institutional indifference. The culminating scene of Chris's documentary showed Mr. James walking into Redwood Falls National Bank. This time the staff greeted him with warmth and courtesy. A new interim manager, apparently handpicked by corporate to quell the controversy, personally helped Mr. James deposit his latest check, as Chris filmed from outside the bank window, this time with permission. He caught the faint smile on the older man's face. It was a small act, depositing a check, something that most people do so casually. But for Mr. James, it had become a symbol of perseverance and rightful belonging. The camera panned from that image to the bank's stately exterior, capturing both the tangible building and the intangible hope that Redwood Falls might now be on a path to genuine reform. Chris ended his filming stint not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet conviction. He saw Redwood Falls as a testament to how quickly a community can rally around an injustice once it's brought to light. Yes, there were still skeptics. And yes, corporate fixes could sometimes be superficial if not vigilantly monitored. But a single story of Mr. James being refused service had caused an uproar that swept through the entire institution. It reminded Chris that change often starts with a moment of moral clarity, in this case, stepping forward when you witness a person being mistreated. As he and Miss James shook hands on the final day of filming, the older man's eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me," Mr. James said softly, "for helping me fight to be seen." Chris's victory wasn't some dramatic showdown. It was a strategic and moral win. By gathering evidence, championing Mr. James's cause, and presenting the truth in front of the community, he forced the bank to stop hiding behind blanket policies. In a sense, Redwood Falls National Bank's veneer of impeccable service had been shattered, but in the aftermath, there was a chance for real improvement. The small town's sense of neighborly care, so integral to its identity, reasserted itself. People took a stand, letting corporate policies know that Redwood Falls wouldn't abandon its own. And that, Chris thought, was the essence of a true victory. As the dust settled, Chris had one last conversation with Amanda, away from the cameras. She spoke of how she planned to remain at the bank, at least for a while, to ensure the new directives were implemented fairly. "I might not have the power of a celebrity, but if I can help even one more person like Mr. James feel welcomed here, it'll be worth it." Chris admired her resolve, aware that real change often relies on the grit of people within the system. Amanda had gone from a reluctant witness to a quiet warrior for customers' rights. A transformation that would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. Eventually, Chris packed up and left Redwood Falls, the horizon stretching before him under a clearing sky. The documentary footage would require months of editing and careful narration, but he carried with him the raw essence of something profoundly hopeful. Through confronting a seemingly minor injustice, he had unearthed a deeper institutional problem and helped the community reclaim some measure of dignity and fairness. He reflected on how many more Redwood Falls existed across the world, towns where policies and prejudices might be driving away those in need of extra help. Perhaps by telling this story, he could inspire others to question, to stand up, and to push for change in their own hometowns. Before departing, he stopped by Mr. James's modest home, a cozy one, story house surrounded by a small garden. They shared a simple farewell, a handshake, a heartfelt thank you, and a promise from Chris to stay in touch. Then he climbed behind the wheel of his SUV and set out toward the highway. The clouds had broken, revealing a swath of bright blue overhead. Sunlight bounced off the fields outside Redwood Falls, lighting the gentle hills with a soft glow. Chris felt a sense of closure and optimism. He hadn't come to Redwood Falls expecting to alter the trajectory of a local bank's policies. Yet sometimes, life's unpredictable intersections made for the most meaningful stories. In the days that followed, Redwood Falls National Bank posted new notices around its lobby. "We welcome customers of all abilities. Ask us about our updated accessibility options." Staff members, newly trained, offered chairs or private desks to those needing extra time. Some were still awkward in their approach, trying to unlearn years of habit. But the shift was visible. As the scandal's memory faded, a new resolve took root among the employees who stayed on. They began forging relationships with customers that mirrored the bank's original mission: to truly serve the people. At the national level, the corporate entity behind Redwood Falls National Bank saw improved public relations once word spread that they'd changed their stance. Though Chris knew the real credit belonged to the everyday folks who demanded better treatment. The transformation, slow but sure, stood as evidence that even institutions could learn from a well-placed nudge toward empathy. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Redwood Falls incident was how local citizens, once complacent, found their voices. They showed up at town hall meetings to discuss accessibility and other aspects of public life. Libraries, grocery stores, the local courthouse. Amanda led a small volunteer initiative, printing large type forms for people with vision impairments. Mr. James, now more confident, volunteered at the senior center, helping others navigate basic banking tasks, telling them never to let fear or shame silence them. And in a heartwarming show of support, Redwood Falls collectively raised a small fund to help older residents pay for technology that could aid in financial transactions, like signature stamps or special tablets. On the surface, Redwood Falls might have seemed an ordinary place, overshadowed by bigger cities. But that was exactly the point of the story Chris told. How seemingly small episodes of injustice in unassuming towns can mirror broader institutional failures, and how the spark of one moment, captured at the right time, can prompt real and lasting change. In an age often swayed by apathy, Redwood Falls' determination to do better was the flicker of hope the world needed. When Chris's documentary finally premiered a few months later, first online, then in select community screenings across the country, it generated respectful conversations. Critics praised its balanced approach, neither demonizing all banks nor sensationalizing the moment, but showing a nuanced portrait of policy, prejudice, and courage. Financial institutions outside Redwood Falls took note, sometimes to avoid similar public relations fiascos. Disability advocates found a valuable tool in the documentary, using it to push for better accommodations in other sectors. And across social media, ordinary viewers shared the Redwood Falls story, inspired by how one man refused service ultimately forced an entire institution to confront its ethics. Through Chris Hemsworth's lens, Redwood Falls' journey resonated as a testament to perseverance, empathy, and unity. Though Chris went on to film other projects, some big blockbuster roles, some smaller philanthropic pieces, he never forgot the day he first stepped into Redwood Falls National Bank and witnessed the callous refusal of service to Mr. James. The experience stayed with him as a reminder of why it matters to speak up, why it's vital to push back against policy masquerading as righteousness. Sometimes, the greatest heroism is found not in grand gestures, but in the willingness to quietly stand beside someone wronged. That spirit of quiet heroism now infused Redwood Falls, leaving behind a legacy of learning and a guidepost for how institutions can transform. And, just as important, it left a lasting bond between Chris and the humble folks he met in that small Minnesota town. A bond rooted in shared purpose, open hearts, and the conviction that every person's dignity is worth defending. New powerful story drops every evening starting tomorrow. Hit subscribe and continue this journey of awakening and hope. You'll discover how everyday encounters can spark extraordinary transformations in the most unexpected places. Join us, and let these stories remind you that change is always possible when individuals dare to stand together and speak for what is right.